What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors suddenly clashes with a late-night host on live television? Fans tuning into Jimmy Kimmel Live expected a relaxed and funny interview with Keanu Reeves. But according to people inside the studio, the conversation slowly turned tense after host Jimmy Kimmel kept pressing Keanu with questions that felt more personal than playful. Make sure to subscribe to Fame After Hours and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The audience clapped loudly as Keanu walked onto stage wearing a dark jacket and black jeans. Jimmy greeted him with a handshake and a smile, while the crowd continued cheering. "Look at this reaction," Jimmy laughed. "People love you." Keanu smiled politely. "That's very kind." Jimmy motioned toward the audience. "Seriously, I don't think I've ever seen people this excited for someone who barely even uses social media." The audience laughed. "That might be why," Keanu replied quietly. Jimmy grinned. "See? That right there. You always sound mysterious." Keanu shrugged slightly. "I'm not trying to." At first, the interview felt normal. Jimmy asked about Keanu's new action movie, the stunt training, and how exhausting filming had become over the years. "You still do most of your own stunts," Jimmy said. "At some point, your body has to complain." "Oh, it definitely complains," Keanu answered with a small laugh. The audience reacted warmly. Jimmy then showed an old photo from one of Keanu's early movies. "Look at this haircut," he joked. Keanu laughed while covering his face briefly. "Yeah, that happened." Everything seemed relaxed until Jimmy slowly changed direction. "You become this internet legend now," Jimmy said. "People call you the nicest man in Hollywood." The crowd applauded loudly again. Keanu nodded politely. "I've heard that." Jimmy leaned back in his chair. "Does that ever annoy you?" Keanu looked slightly confused. "Not really. Come on," Jimmy continued. "Nobody likes being turned into a perfect human being online." "I don't think anybody sees themselves that way," Keanu replied. Jimmy smirked. "But people definitely see you that way." Keanu stayed calm. "That's their opinion." Jimmy tapped his mug against the desk. "See, this is why people think you're impossible to read." The audience laughed lightly. Keanu smiled a little. "Maybe I'm just private." Jimmy interrupted quickly. "Or careful." The crowd reacted with a few nervous laughs. Keanu looked toward Jimmy more directly now. "Careful about what?" Jimmy shrugged. "Public image. Hollywood stuff." There was a brief silence. Keanu answered calmly. "I think most people just try to get through life the best they can." Jimmy nodded slowly but kept pushing. "Sure, but fame changes people. Sometimes. And sometimes celebrities become very good at acting off camera too." The audience reaction became quieter. Keanu crossed his arms lightly. "What do you try to say?" Jimmy laughed awkwardly. "Nothing about you specifically. But you keep bringing it back to me." A few people in the crowd reacted with soft "Os." Jimmy smiled tightly. "I'm just saying people online treat you like some perfect saint." Keanu shook his head. "That sounded more like an internet problem than mine." The audience clapped loudly at that response. Jimmy forced a laugh. "Fair point." For a moment, the tension eased again. Jimmy changed topics and asked about motorcycles, something Keanu clearly enjoyed discussing more. The actor relaxed while talking about long rides and traveling quietly without security. "That sounds peaceful," Jimmy admitted. "It can be?" Jimmy looked at him carefully before speaking again. "You really don't enjoy the fame side of things, do you?" Keanu paused. "I appreciate the opportunities. Attention is different." Jimmy leaned forward. "But attention also keeps careers alive." "That may be true." Jimmy smiled slightly. "So maybe being known as the nicest celebrity in the world helps business too." This time the audience reaction was noticeably uncomfortable. Keanu's expression changed. "I've never thought about it like that." Jimmy shrugged. "Maybe you should." The room became quieter. Keanu stared at Jimmy for a second before replying calmly. "You seem very focused on proving kindness isn't real." Several audience members clapped loudly, while others gasped. Jimmy laughed, though it sounded forced. "No, I'm focused on reality." "So am I," Keanu answered. Jimmy shifted in his chair. "All right, let me ask directly then. Is the nice guy reputation accurate, or is part of a performance?" The audience groaned immediately. Keanu blinked slowly. Why does that matter so much to you? Jimmy looked surprised. It's a question, and I'm asking one too. The tension inside the studio suddenly became impossible to ignore. Jimmy glanced briefly toward the crowd before looking back at Keanu. You know, most guests play along a little easier. Keanu nodded once. Maybe most guests aren't being accused of pretending to be decent people. The audience exploded with applause. Jimmy stopped smiling completely. I didn't accuse you of anything, he replied. Keanu leaned back in his chair. It feels like you did. A long silence followed as both men looked at each other, while the crowd waited nervously for someone to speak next. The silence in the studio lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. The audience shifted uncomfortably while Jimmy Kimmel forced a smile and adjusted the cards sitting on his desk. Well, Jimmy said with a short laugh, this became serious very fast. A few scattered laughs came from the audience, but the energy remained tense. Keanu Reeves stayed calm in his chair. I'm not trying to make it serious. Jimmy nodded. Okay, then maybe we reset. Keanu gave a polite nod back. Jimmy leaned forward again. Look, I think people are fascinated by you because you don't act like most celebrities. That's not an insult. I didn't say it was. But you seem defensive. Keanu's expression barely changed. I think anybody would react if they felt questioned personally. Jimmy replied quickly. That's what interviews are. The audience reacted with another uncomfortable murmur. Keanu folded his hands together. Interviews are conversations too. Jimmy smiled thinly. And conversations can get uncomfortable. Sure, Keanu answered, but there's usually respect involved. That line drew loud applause from several people in the crowd. Jimmy looked toward the audience with raised eyebrows. Wow, they really are on your side tonight. A few people laughed nervously. Keanu immediately shook his head. It's not sides. Jimmy pointed toward him jokingly. Easy for you to say when you're winning. The crowd reacted again, this time more uncertain about whether Jimmy was joking or irritated. Keanu looked down briefly before answering. I'm not trying to win anything. Jimmy leaned back in his chair. Then help me understand something. Why does every simple question suddenly feel offensive to you? Keanu looked genuinely surprised. I don't think they were simple questions. Jimmy laughed. I asked if fame changes people, and then suggested I was performing kindness. Jimmy interrupted immediately. Because Hollywood is full of performance. Keanu nodded slowly. That doesn't mean everyone is fake. The audience clapped again. Jimmy's smile disappeared for a second before returning. See, the audience loves every answer you give. That's the problem. Keanu frowned slightly. Why is that a problem? Because now I can't challenge you without looking like the villain. A louder reaction spread through the studio. Keanu stayed quiet for a moment before speaking carefully. Maybe it's not about challenging. Maybe it's about tone. Jimmy tilted his head. Tone? Yes. Jimmy laughed again. Now I'm being graded on tone. The audience gave mixed reactions. Keanu answered calmly. You asked. Jimmy picked up his mug and took a sip, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. All right, he said after a moment. Let's move to something lighter before Twitter turns this into a civil war. That finally got a bigger laugh from the crowd. Jimmy pulled out a photo of Keanu riding a motorcycle. You still travel alone sometimes? Yes. No security? Usually not. Jimmy shook his head dramatically. That's insane. If I had your level of fame, I'd never leave my house. Keanu smiled faintly. That sounds stressful. It is stressful, Jimmy admitted. People are weird. The tension eased slightly as the audience laughed. Jimmy continued. But seriously, doesn't it bother you when strangers record you everywhere you go? Sometimes. And you never snap at them? Keanu paused. I'm human. Jimmy leaned forward quickly. So it has happened. Keanu looked at him carefully. Everybody loses patience sometimes. Jimmy pointed toward the audience. There it is. Finally. A few people laughed while others stayed quiet. Keanu gave a small smile. That wasn't confession. Jimmy grinned. Close enough. Keanu shook his head slightly. See, that's what I mean. Jimmy looked confused. What? You keep trying to turn every answer into something else. The audience reacted instantly again. Jimmy sighed heavily this time. All right, now I'm frustrated. Keanu remained calm. Okay. Jimmy looked directly at him. Because honestly, it feels like you came out here expecting a problem. That's not true. Then why are we arguing? Keanu thought for a moment before replying. I don't think we started arguing until you kept questioning whether I was genuine. Jimmy spread his hands. I question everybody. But not everybody gets asked the same thing 5 different ways. The audience clapped loudly again. Jimmy chuckled sarcastically. Amazing. Even when you call somebody out, you sound calm. Keanu replied quietly, I don't think yelling helps. That line caused another strong audience reaction. Jimmy looked off stage briefly, then back at Keanu. You know what's funny? Before the show, everyone backstage kept saying how impossible it would be to get you annoyed. Keanu's face hardened slightly. Maybe that shouldn't have been the goal. The audience went completely silent. Jimmy blinked. Nobody said it was a goal. Keanu held eye contact with him. It feels like it was. For the first time all interview, Jimmy looked genuinely caught off guard. A producer could briefly be seen near the side of stage motioning toward the desk, as if trying to wrap things up. Jimmy noticed it too, but ignored it. So what now? Jimmy asked, You think I brought you out here to embarrass you? Keanu answered calmly, but firmly. I think this stopped being a conversation a while ago. The crowd erupted into nervous applause as Jimmy stared at him without speaking. The audience applause slowly faded, but the tension inside Jimmy Kimmel Live stayed heavy. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together while trying to smile again. All right, Jimmy said carefully. Clearly we're having 2 different conversations tonight. Keanu Reeves remained calm. Maybe. Jimmy nodded. Because from my perspective, I'm doing what I always do with guests. Keanu replied quietly. And from my perspective, it stopped feeling respectful. A loud reaction came from the crowd again. Jimmy immediately pointed toward the audience. See, that right there? Every time you answer, people clap like you just ended a debate. Keanu looked uncomfortable hearing that. I'm not trying to debate you. But we are debating, Jimmy replied. That's obvious now. Keanu stayed silent for a moment. Jimmy continued speaking before he could answer. You know what this reminds me of? Politicians. They stay calm while the other person looks emotional. The audience reacted with surprised laughter. Keanu frowned slightly. I think that's unfair. Jimmy shrugged. Maybe, but you're very careful with your words. I'm trying to communicate clearly. Jimmy smiled tightly. Exactly. Keanu let out a slow breath. You keep turning normal responses into something suspicious. Jimmy interrupted quickly. Because you never answer emotionally. That's not true. Really? Jimmy asked. You haven't raised your voice once. Keanu looked directly at him. Would that make you more comfortable? The crowd erupted loudly. Jimmy laughed while shaking his head. No, but would feel more honest. Keanu looked genuinely confused now. You think calm people are dishonest? Jimmy leaned forward. No, I think celebrities know how to stay controlled on camera. Keanu nodded once. And hosts know how to provoke reactions. The audience exploded again. Jimmy stopped smiling completely. Okay, he said firmly. Now you're accusing me. Keanu answered immediately. No, I'm describing what's happening. Jimmy pointed at him across the desk. You keep saying things like that. Calm words with sharp meanings. Keanu crossed his arms lightly. I could say the same thing. For a second, neither man spoke. Jimmy finally broke the silence. You know, people backstage warned me this might happen. The audience quieted instantly. Keanu looked surprised. What does that mean? Jimmy hesitated briefly. They said you don't like personal questions. Keanu shook his head. That's not true. Then what is true? Keanu answered calmly. I don't like conversations where somebody keeps trying to expose something that isn't there. Several audience members clapped loudly. Jimmy laughed again, but now his frustration was obvious. Nobody's exposing anything. It feels like you want a different version of me. Jimmy raised his eyebrows. Maybe I want a real version. A loud gasp spread through the crowd. Keanu stared at Jimmy for several seconds without blinking. "That's disrespectful," he said quietly. Jimmy immediately threw his hands up. "See? That's exactly what I mean. The second somebody questions you, it becomes disrespect." Keanu's tone stayed controlled. "No. Suggesting somebody's entire personality is fake is disrespectful." The audience applauded hard again. Jimmy looked toward the band area and laughed sarcastically. "This is unbelievable." Keanu shook his head slightly. "It doesn't have to be." Jimmy leaned closer. "Then answer honestly. Why are you really upset?" Keanu paused before responding. "Because this interview feels less interested in conversation and more interested in tearing people down." The studio became very quiet. Jimmy stared at him. "You think I tear people down?" "I think sometimes late-night television rewards that behavior." The audience reacted loudly once again. Jimmy looked stunned for a moment before speaking carefully. "You realize you're insulting my entire profession on my own show." Keanu answered softly. "You asked me to be honest." Jimmy let out a frustrated laugh. "And you know what? I think you came out here prepared for conflict." Keanu shook his head immediately. "No." "Yes," Jimmy insisted. "Every answer sounds rehearsed." Keanu looked disappointed more than angry now. "That's because you decided who I was before I walked out here." The audience gave another strong reaction. Jimmy opened his mouth to answer, but stopped himself. He glanced off stage again, where producers were visibly signaling toward the commercial break. "All right," Jimmy muttered. "We're apparently running out of time." Keanu nodded politely. "Okay." Jimmy looked back at him. "One last question, then." The audience became silent again. Jimmy folded his hands together. "Do you regret coming on the show tonight?" Keanu looked at him calmly. Then, after a long pause, he answered, "I regret what the conversation became." The crowd reacted instantly with loud applause mixed with shocked murmurs. Jimmy forced a smile that clearly didn't reach his eyes. "Fair enough," he said quietly. Keanu gave a small nod. But instead of relaxing back into his chair, he suddenly reached for the microphone clipped to his jacket as the tension inside the studio grew even heavier. As the audience kept reacting, Keanu Reeves unclipped the microphone from his jacket slowly and placed it on Jimmy Kimmel's desk. The entire studio went silent. Jimmy looked confused at first. "Wait, what are you doing?" Keanu stood up calmly from his chair. "I think I'm done." A loud wave of shock reaction spread through the audience. Jimmy gave an awkward laugh while glancing toward the cameras. "Come on, seriously?" Keanu nodded once. "Yeah." The band members looked at each other uncertainly, while producers rushed near the side of the stage. Audience members could be seen pulling out phones, even though staff immediately signaled for them to stop recording. Jimmy stood halfway from his seat. "Keanu, hold on. We're just having a conversation." Keanu looked back at him calmly. It stopped feeling like one. The audience reacted loudly again, with some people clapping while others sat frozen in silence. Jimmy spread his hands in frustration. "So that's it? You're walking out." Keanu answered quietly, "I don't think this is productive anymore." Jimmy laughed nervously. "You know this is live to tape, right?" A few uncomfortable laughs came from the crowd. Keanu nodded politely. "I know." For a moment it looked like Jimmy wanted to continue arguing, but the tension in the room had become overwhelming. Keanu shook hands quickly with one band member near the stage before walking toward the exit. As he disappeared backstage, the audience erupted into a mixture of applause, gasps, and confused shouting. Jimmy remained standing beside his desk for several seconds without speaking. Finally, he sat back down and rubbed his forehead. "Well," he muttered, "that happened." The audience laughed awkwardly. Jimmy tried forcing a smile. "I honestly don't even know what to say right now." One audience member shouted, "You pushed too hard." The crowd reacted loudly again. Jimmy pointed toward the audience. "See, now I'm getting yelled at too." A few people laughed, but the mood stayed tense. Jimmy looked off stage where producers were clearly speaking into headsets rapidly. "We're going to take a break," he said quickly. "Apparently everybody needs one." The show cut to commercial almost immediately. According to people who claimed they were inside the studio, the atmosphere during the break was chaotic. Audience members were talking over each other, while staff moved around quickly near the stage. Some people believe the argument was staged at first, but others said Keanu looked genuinely frustrated before leaving. When the show returned from commercial, Jimmy's energy felt completely different. He gave a short smile toward the audience. "So, Keanu Reeves," he said awkwardly. The crowd responded with mixed applause and nervous laughter. Jimmy leaned back in his chair. "I think that interview went slightly off schedule." More awkward laughs followed. He avoided discussing the situation directly after that and moved quickly into the next segment. But viewers online had already started reacting before the episode even finished airing. Within minutes, clips from the interview spread across social media platforms. Hashtag connected to Jimmy Kimmel Live. And Keanu began trending worldwide as viewers debated who was responsible for the argument. Some people defended Jimmy, saying hosts are supposed to ask difficult questions and challenge celebrities instead of giving safe interviews. Others strongly supported Keanu, arguing that Jimmy kept pushing the same point repeatedly until the conversation became uncomfortable. One viral post read, "Keanu stayed calm the entire time while Jimmy kept escalating." Another wrote, "That was one of the most awkward late-night interviews I've ever watched." Several entertainment commentators discussed the moment the next morning, especially the instant when Keanu removed his microphone and walked off stage. Neither Jimmy nor Keanu immediately addressed the situation publicly after the episode aired. Sources connected to the show later claimed there was no screaming backstage, and that Keanu left quietly after speaking briefly with producers. Meanwhile, fans continued debating whether the interview revealed something deeper about celebrity culture, late-night television, and the pressure public figures face during interviews designed to create viral moments. Even people who rarely watch talk shows began sharing clips and opinions online. By the next day, the interview had become one of the most talked-about celebrity television moments of the week. And now viewers everywhere divided over the same question. Did Jimmy push too far? Or did Keanu overreact to tough questions on live television? Share your opinion in the comments, and subscribe to Fame After Hours for more real talk show stories.